Coogs House, the ACC is officially about to fall apart. Brett Yormark is taking notes, and the Cougs should too.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, the daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater can stop by, thank you for making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. Appreciate you making your first listen each and every day here at Locked On Cougs. And we're doing the conversation. If you don't know what to say, tell us in the comments down below what you think of South Carolina barbecue. Because today we're talking about the ACC falling apart, specifically because of Clemson and Florida State. Clemson's in South Carolina. They got barbecue there. I don't think you compare it to Texas, but we'll talk more about that if the time comes. Today's show is brought to you by Nissan. Great place to get a ride. We'll talk more on that in a second as well. But the ACC is falling apart. That's the news today in college football on Tuesday, and it does trickle its way to the Big 12 in Houston like very quickly. So I want to make sure we hit that, talk about what this could mean for the Big 12 and for Houston, as well as some other like kind of Big 12-y kind of things out there while we're on the topic that tie to Houston as well. Just a lot going on in the world of Big 12 college football, and Houston's kind of attached to all of it in a different way. But if you missed the news of the day, the ACC kind of set up their own end date officially. Now, the optimist, if you're an ACC person, would be, I guess, that they have until 2030, but they reached a settlement in the Florida State Clemson case where the two schools sued ACC for the right to get out of the conference that having to pay this exorbitant fee. They signed like a 20-year contract back in 2016 and right? And it's going to be a seemingly infinite amount of money to get out of the contract, get out of the conference. Increasingly, the ACC was behind the eight ball on what they were getting paid relative to people in the SEC, Big Ten, and really very quickly about to be the Big 12 as well. But anyway, the way the settlement went down was Clemson and Florida State kind of won in some ways, in that they both could be gone as early as 2030. The price tag to get out in 2030 got lowered down to $100 million, and it goes down every year after that between 2030 and 2036. That feels like a major victory for those two schools. In terms of what happened on the other side of the settlement, I think that an ACC person would point out that them getting out 5 years from now is a win for the conference. But the other part that I think Brett Yormark is going to be taking notes on is there is this interesting redistribution of the revenue, right? The more viewed programs in terms of college football, obviously the big money driver here, will get to take home higher portions of the pot, so to speak. And so what's interesting here is that there's a 5-year window where Clemson and Florida State will ultimately get to see how that pans out and decide if they want to stay in the conference or not in 2030 and yada, yada, yada. I'm here to tell you that that's not going to happen. These schools are going to get out of this thing by 2030. But what is going to happen is that other conferences are going to monitor how that works for the ACC and debate if they need to incorporate it as well, right? It makes sense. The more competitive you are, the more you win, the more viewers you have, the more you bring to the table as a school, you theoretically get paid more out. Brett Yormark is always looking at what other teams are doing, what people are doing. And I'm here to say that I don't think it's in the Big 12's best interest to do that, but I also don't think it's in Houston's best interest for that to be the way that things go. The Big 12 is kind of built on chaos and this like wildly large even playing field where like any program can be hot at any moment. You have Houston in 2015-16. You have Houston the last couple of years. I mean, you have Houston in 2020. Was it one? Like these things can all happen very fluidly. You have the Art Briles Baylor. You have 2 years ago Baylor. You have last year's Baylor. Like all these different programs, right, can go up and down. And I think that ultimately that's a strength of the conference. And financially incentivizing some other level of this instead of keeping that even and keeping that flat, right? To the degree you can. There are going to be other ways that the league is not flat, but I think that that's counterintuitive what makes the conference really, really great. What will be interesting, though, is if this shifts college football. If the ACC does this, it works out well, and then like Ohio State, Michigan tell the Big Ten, we want to do the same thing. We're tired of, not having this. We think we bring more to the table than Purdue and Maryland, right? Or in the SEC, if Alabama's like, we don't want to be in the same, we bring more to this than Mississippi State. We don't want to be considered the same as them or whatever, right? They could ultimately shift how all of these conferences go. And then I worry that if all of these conferences go down this route where the teams that get more viewers, the programs that get more viewers or whatever, get more of a say in that dollars and cents, that could lead to the Big 12 kind of having their hands tied. You can't be the last one to dinner, so to speak, in that way, right? Now, I will say that the ACC is doing that and it could all flop. I could see this being the kind of thing where, a program that, has one spike of a year and then they go down, and they're saying they use like a 3-year average, but also like we know that you could just have a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback and have a lot of viewership across the country for like 2 of those 3 years or whatever, and things could go crazy. Like how this all plays out is going to be really interesting to watch the ACC, and I honestly don't know that any of it matters as far as these survive, like how that conference survives and how those teams stay together. The ACC's already got a wonky conference, like randomly has 2 California teams and 1 in Texas, and everyone else is east in the Mississippi. Like this just doesn't feel cohesive as far as like building that TV viewership and all of that goes to make all of this pan out. I also think that ultimately this is just a 5-year window for Florida State and Clemson to build up and quickly find their, get their, ducks in order or get their T's crossed and I's dotted or whatever to get that $100 million to ultimately work towards buying themselves out of this in 2030. I also think that number gets lowered for them and everyone else, much like that revenue split gets split for them and everyone else. I also think that you're looking at, Florida State went like 2-10 last year or whatever, abysmal record they had. Do they really want to lean into anything that has to do with success? I mean, they've seen as well as anyone. You can go from your highest of highs one year to your lowest of lows the next year and think you did everything right in the in-between, right? And so I just feel like all this is heading towards ideas that are going to crumble the ACC, even if that idea of distributing the wealth in such a way could ultimately lead to it could ultimately lead to this idea of other conferences doing it, right? Yormark's going to keep an eye on that, just like Sankey and all the other commissioners are as well. Like I said, I don't think it's within the Big 12's best interest because the Big 12 has all of the goal of the Big 12, right, is the chaos of last year. Like you went into the last 2 weeks and like 8 different teams could win the conference in football. And that meant everyone's paying attention to everybody. And so any success driven thing is going to kind of pull back from that because the money's going to help the rich get richer. And you don't necessarily want that that's not the beauty of the Big 12. It's not what sets the Big 12 apart. It's not the SEC with like 2 or 3 top dogs and everyone else is kind of playing for second place, or the Big 10 is Ohio State, Michigan, and then everyone else plays for third, right? Like they get their Indianas every now and then or whatever, but the Big 12 is great because it was everybody, right? And that's the fun part about it. And distributing the wealth with success is going to start to, shift and change and alter those measurements. Now, I say that until Conor Wegman has this Heisman campaign or whatever that throws everything in a loop, and ultimately Houston's on top. Then let's start paying the people on top the most, obviously, right? Obviously, my perspective could shift and things like that when Houston gets there. But in an off season for football, because football is the revenue driver here, I don't know that I think that's a great idea for other conferences to follow. Clemson and Florida State got it as a bargaining chip in their conversations with the ACC and their settlement with the ACC, and kudos to them for doing it. And, they'll be on top of viewership things for sure. But I still think they're just going to use that extra money to throw in a piggy bank to get out of this thing in 2030, which is going to crumble that conference. It's going to sink that conference, and there are going to be schools on the chopping block. And I think that leads to a pretty interesting conversation about how many of the schools could end up with the Big 12 and Houston, and how many could be too many. And if we're actually approaching a point where that is on the table, where too many is an option. Before we get to all that, though, I did say that today's show is brought to you by Nissan. The Armada Team of the Week is brought to you by our fellow friends at Nissan. You're going to like this one, folks. The all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Each week, our locked-on college basketball experts are picking one team that stands apart from the top-seeded stars to the unexpected upsets. These guys showcase strength and sheer power needed to push their team forward. Now, I promise I only got one vote in this, but this week's Armada and clear-cut team of the week are the Houston Cougars. Your Houston Cougars snatched the Cougs. Since joining the Big 12 last season, the Cougars have gone a combined 33-4 in conference games, winning the regular season title by multiple games in both years. There is no team in college basketball that more capably embodies the rugged Armada than Kelvin Sampson's squad. Houston's tenacious defense leads the nation in fewest points allowed per game for the second straight season. Just like that, our team of the week is out here ready to conquer the road ahead with confidence, just like you in the all-new Nissan Armada or any of Nissan's outstanding vehicles. Take the Nissan Armada, Rogue, or Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. Locked on Coogs, Parker Ainsworth here, talking about things going on in the Big 12 that are shaping Houston's future, whether we like it or not. Some of those things are happening outside of the Big 12 and ultimately coming into the Big 12. And one of those things is that the ACC is set to fall apart in 2030. Right now, with Florida State and Clemson kind of, again, crossing T's, dotting I's, ready to get out of the conference in 2030. That means the ACC is going to be looking for ways to replace some big players in terms of revenue, right? And I think the deal is going to be the more likely scenario is that the third, fourth, fifth big players in terms of revenue are also going to be looking to get out. Because why would you, who's ACC going to bring in that's replacing Florida State or Clemson, right? And so what they're going to do is you're going to see this conference very quickly become an arms race where all the programs are looking to get $100 million by 2030 to throw on the table and get out of that deal. Now, what's going to be interesting here is that I don't think Clemson and Florida State are the teams that the Big 12 would look to add. If you're asking me to be a gambler, I bet they'd go to the SEC a lot of the way Texas and Oklahoma did a couple years back, and ultimately announced that that's what they're going and whatever, right? And unlike what happened with the Big 12, the ACC would splinter because the Big 12's kind of taken all that next tier of schools or given Houston the chance to elevate, or Cincinnati's or whatever, right? Now, Houston's shown on the basketball court they deserve to be in the Big 12, a few other sports as well, volleyball and things like that. And I think, the way that Willie Fritz has the football program going, things will get there in that as well. But as far as the ACC schools, there isn't a Houston Cougar program out there for them to go get in the same kind of way anymore. Conference realignment has kind of already happened. The Pac-12 is falling apart. The ACC is going to do the same, right? And so when it happens, where do those schools go, right? And what programs end up where? Ultimately, I could see NC State and Virginia Tech both becoming Big 12 schools. It adds a couple of states in Virginia and North Carolina to the Big 12 as far as expanding to more states for the TV deals and so on. It also adds some rivalry games with Virginia Tech and West Virginia. I think Pitt could do the same. You had the state of Pennsylvania for what it's worth. NC State, there is the whole deal with Houston. that did happen, as much as we want to think of it as a bad dream, back in the 80s in basketball. As far as football goes, I think that they could also get geographically lumped into the Cincinnatis and the West Virginias and stuff like that over in that part of the country very, very easily. They also just feel very Big 12 school as far as the culture of the schools go, where they're strong in football in a given season. They've got good basketball programs that go up and down, at least Virginia Tech and NC State goes up and down some, like they were good last year, whatever, right? But Virginia Tech, you see go up and down some. Pitt, you see go up and down some. They got a great kid from the city of Houston actually on their basketball team right now. Really, really good basketball player. But so I could see those kinds of things filling out the conference. I've said before, I think like Miami feels like a very Yormark ad. I think Miami is going to be one of the teams that people are kind of trying to entice to come to their conference. We know Yormark likes big cities and markets, hence adding a school like Houston, right? We also know that while he already has Central Florida in the state of Florida, it would add kind of another like buddy for them, so to speak, in the conference, another East Coast school. We'll see what happens after Larrañaga leaves and Jai Lucas is there. I maintain, and I tweeted out, we can talk about this later today, I think Jai Lucas there is going to be a problem for some people in the Big 12 that like to recruit Houston and the state of Texas. But that would be a very natural fit. The football program's got an illustrious history. We know Yormark cares about history as well, right? And so I think that that's a natural fit. What I'm intrigued by is that Yormark has a higher value on college basketball than any of the other three commissioners in the Power Four, right? I guess the Big East, you could argue, is always a little bit different, but of the four, the SEC, the ACC, the Big Ten, and the Big 12, Yormark cares about basketball by far and away the most, so much that he's dabbled in, like, do we add UConn and Gonzaga in basketball-only capacities? Why would you add Gonzaga and UConn in basketball-only capacities in 2030 if you could add Duke and Carolina and have that illustrious basketball history, given wherever the program is at that point? Like, Duke's got it hot right now. Carolina was hot a couple years ago. We've seen them both go up and down, whatever. But they also have like competent football programs. Who knows what Bill Belichick and North Carolina football program looks like by 2030? I don't know if he'll still be there, but like the program could have developed, right? And so I think that those are schools to be keeping an eye on because everyone's going to want them. But we know Yormark places a high value on that basketball resume, for better or worse. I know I got commenters that always hate that part, but it's true. He sees it as the way of the future. It's part of the reason Houston's so valuable to him, and those schools have it in droves as well. Now, you could also go the time zones route. We know time zones are important to him, and ACC schools like Cal and Stanford might make more sense in the Big 12 and the ACC to begin with. I could also see those schools becoming Big 10 schools. They kind of spited the Big 10 once upon a time. But anyway, these schools are going to get added. And we said that, for Houston, some number of schools are going to get added. And in the Big 12, like, how big is too big? At what point do you get lost in the madness here? We're talking about very quickly getting up to like around 20 or more Big 12 schools. And I think it's going to honestly... I think more is better for Houston. And I think I'm probably on an island in saying that. But honestly, the more Big 12 schools you add to the conference, the more likely you are to get into some sort of a pods type of region. The more likely you are to play your nearby rivals. A big thing for the fans of the Houston Cougars enjoying the Big 12, dollars and cents aside, was having those water cooler conversations, right? Being able to talk to your buddy that went to Texas Tech on a Monday morning and talk trash about the football game over the weekend, right? Having to shoot the breeze with that guy from Baylor, and it's no longer hypothetical. We actually played each other, right? If adding more schools leads to some sort of a pods alignment, and I think at 20 teams or more, you'd kind of have to, that gets you into those more regular routine rivalries, right? The other part of this is, again, I know that's not the same money driver that football is, But basketball and Houston adding all these schools that have good basketball programs will elevate them as well, right? You saw it this year when Houston started dominating the Big 12 in basketball this season. The conversation was like, wow, the Big 12 is just not quite the same anymore. It's like, no, the Big 12 is the same. Houston's just doing Houston things, right? And so I think that adding some of those more legacy programs will elevate the profile there. I do think that there is some capacity where it's too much. You start getting 24, 26. That's obviously too much. I also think there's a world here where you see, the SEC say, hey, we're going to sit at 16 and add these two. So, hey, Mississippi State, get out of here or whatever, right? And something like that gets going in that direction. That obviously is all fun stuff talking about between now and 2030, but that death knell feels like it got cemented on Tuesday. And so you got to kind of have your head spinning on that if you're Houston about what this conference looks like for the Houston Cougars as we get there. And I want to talk more about something else that's like got your head spinning a little bit with the Big 12 and how that ties to Houston. But before we get too far, today's show is also brought to you by Supply House. Get in on the supplies you need from the site made for skilled trade. Supply House. Whether you're into plumbing, HVAC, or electrical work, Supply House is the reliable way to order products online. If you need help with an order, Supply House offers expert support and industry-leading service, so you'll always talk to a real person. And for trade pros looking for an extra edge, their free TradeMaster program offers exclusive perks like a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Thousands of skilled professionals are already taking advantage, and now it's your turn. Join the TradeMaster program today at supplyhouse.com/TM and start ordering plumbing, HVAC, electrical supplies with just a few clicks. Use promo code SH5 for 5% off your first order at supplyhouse.com. Parker Ainsworth, Locked on Cougs here. Talking a little bit about the Big 12 scene changing some these days and what that does for the Houston Cougars as they navigate the ever-changing world of the Big 12 and college sports. Obviously, like a ground-shaking day in the ACC on Tuesday, and the reverberations are hitting close to home for the Cougs. But one thing that the Cougs and the Big 12 are doing that does shift things, I think, across the entire sport as well, is it was announced in the last week or so that the Big 12, I should say, is down to 3 different capital partners in looking at venture capital groups to help supply the conference, help work with the conference. I think Redbird was like the leading name in that. And it's an interesting concept to say the least. It's an interesting way to go about, throwing money into the conference for everyone. And for what it's worth, I think that going down the venture capital route, equity, any of this, is probably foregoing that like college football by 2040 isn't going to be recognizable anyway, right? I mean, even less so than it is now versus 10 years ago. And I say that because it's hard for me to believe that in the 15 to 20 year run, these things are good for the Big 12, or especially good for Houston. However, if you're like looking at a grim reality, you're like, yeah, but Parker, by 2040 or 2045, college football is just going to be AAA. It's not going to be the same thing. It's just the NFL's AAA league, and none of that's going to matter anyway. The goal is to have as much fun as we can and compete as long as we can between now and then to just get included in the AAA league in the first place, right? I guess if you're convincing me of that, like we've got to get there now because we don't know what it's going to look like in that long-term future kind of thing. I guess that's fair. And I think what you're doing it by going down this route is admitting that like it wasn't going to look good in 2040 anyway. And I say that because you always have to know and listen to and hear what that venture capital group or private equity firm or whatever, what their best interests are going to be, you always have to take the grain of salt. Like their ultimate best interest has to be in reporting back to the money people, has to be to maximize profits. And at some point, again, I teach history, which is not exactly economics, but at some point, it does come down to you're going to alter and shift and make the product cheaper to make revenues higher because you're just trying to stretch that gap between profits and expenses, right? And honestly, I worry that that's going to take a lot of the like character out of college sports that we all love. Again, if you're telling me that by 2040 it's all going to be out of it anyway because they're going to be in AAA football and whatever, then I guess you got to do what you got to do. But it feels like an admission of that if you go too far down that path. The other way we've talked about infusing the conference money is like just putting a bumper sticker on the conference and on everyone's helmets with like Allstate or something, the Allstate 12. And that seems, while I guess there are some people that would be opposed to a NASCAR uniform or whatever, that seems more reasonable to me. You see that like in Europe, a lot of, sports teams have all kinds of marketing stuff all over the front with just a little crest for the athletic program or whatever the franchise. I'd almost rather do that with a straight NASCAR looking jersey than anything else. Especially then like telling me that college football is going to be gone by 2040. And I don't say that as someone who gets to talk about it every day or talk about college sports every day. Obviously that changes some too. I think if Houston were a AAA program, I'd get to talk about them as well. I talk about it more as a guy that like grew up loving college sports and loving watching college sports because it was college kids and all of that, right? Like going down that route's going to shift that a lot. And again, if it's all going away, then sure, whatever you got to do to infuse money into it to make sure the Big 12 stays alive, because that's the only way Houston stays alive. Because, man, if Houston was still in the American Athletic Conference right now, all this was happening, it would be like, should we look at something else, right? And you saw, I think the week before, there's a conversation about like, hey, if a school can't find the $22 million to pay athletes, which Eddie Nunez has said Houston will find, if a school can't find that, do they just not become a D1 program? They could like take a step back, and that may all be futuristic for the schools like West Virginia and Cincinnati that we're talking about that we're hearing that. I think that was very much like a floated Twitter idea that got really big there for a second. But I said to say that like this private equity conversation or this venture capital conversation is one to keep a very close eye on for Houston. Because it's going to throw a lot of money in the pot right away for the conference, for the school, and things are going to get really good really fast. And then over the course of like the next 10 years, things are going to change a lot. And it's about if that cost is worth it, because that cost is what gives people the profit that they're deeming as worth it. Now, I know that's a lot of Big 12 talk today, a lot of like big picture conference talk. Second episode as well, a little bit of a bonus out there on just Houston Cougars, LJ Cryer, the point guard position, and more as well, coming at you very, very soon at Locked on Coogs. So make sure you subscribe at the bell so you know we're live. Trying to get you at, a little bit of a maniac in March. We sleep in May, as they say about college basketball, and so a lot of content coming out these days. Make sure you subscribe at the bell so you know we're live. Locked on Coogs, primarily Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team every day. Go Cougs.